We all have World Cup defeats in mind that marked history. The 7-1 between Brazil and Germany, for example. And yet, it's only one among many. As we get closer to the 2026 World Cup, it's the perfect moment to look back at the biggest defeats of every World Cup from 1982 to 2022, and you'll see that sometimes it's not always the smallest teams that take the biggest hits. We'll see that, especially in 2022. But let's start right away with 1982, and we're starting strong. On June 15, 1982, at the Martínez Valero Stadium in Elche, Hungary would write its name in history. Facing them, El Salvador, a small Central American country qualifying for only the second time in its history. In the 4th minute, Nalasi opens the scoring. Then, Poloske doubles the lead in the 11th. And before the 25th minute, Fazekas scores the third, 3-0 at halftime. A demonstration, but no one can imagine what's coming next. After the break, Hungary keeps rolling. Toth, Fazekas again, then Kiss, who scores a hat-trick in just 7 minutes, and Sentis join the party. Even Nalasi grabs a brace at the end of the match. 10 goals for Hungary, only 1 for El Salvador, scored by Ramirez in the 64th. Final score, 10-1. In the stands, 23,000 spectators witness a historic humiliation. That night, Hungary becomes the team that has scored the most goals in a single World Cup match, a record still unbeaten more than 40 years later. But in a twist of fate, 4 years after handing El Salvador the biggest defeat in World Cup history, Hungary would now suffer its own. Off to Mexico, the stage of the 1986 World Cup. A unique tournament. Just a few months earlier, in September 1985, a terrible earthquake struck the country. The organization of the World Cup was called into question, but the stadiums were spared, and the competition was ultimately able to go ahead without issue. It's also a landmark edition, because starting in 1986, finals would no longer be replayed in case of a draw. From now on, they would be decided by penalty shootouts. And in the very first match of Group C, Hungary would live a nightmare. Facing the Soviet Union, the match quickly turned into a disaster. Yakovlenko scored in the 2nd minute, Alanikov doubled the lead in the 4th, and Belanov converted a penalty in the 24th, 3-0 at halftime. In the second half, the Soviets continued the massacre. Yaremchuk, an own goal by Deka, then Rodionov sealed the score, 6-0. Under the Irapuato sun, in front of 16,500 spectators, Hungary suffered its heaviest World Cup defeat. A cruel irony for a team that, just 4 years earlier, had recorded the most lopsided victory in history. After Hungary in 1986, it was time for other nations to taste the harsh reality of the 1990 World Cup. A World Cup hosted in Italy, marked by tight defensive matches, one of the most boring editions according to specialists, with very few goals, but also 2 heavy beatings that stood out. The first took place in Milan, at the legendary San Siro. West Germany faced the United Arab Emirates, a team playing in its very first World Cup, and the step was far too high. Vuller opened the scoring, Klinsmann followed, then Matthias, Bain, and Vuller again sealed a dominant 5-1 win, a demonstration in front of more than 71,000 spectators. But it wasn't the only thrashing of the tournament. In Florence, Czechoslovakia inflicted the exact same score on the USA, who were making their big return after 40 years away from the World Cup. Skuravi scored a brace. Bilek, Hasek, and Luhovi completed the festival. The Americans saved some pride through Caligiuri, but also lost 5-1, 2 identical humiliations, and above all, a perfect transition, because 4 years later, it would be in the United States themselves that the 1994 World Cup would take place. A historic edition, the first ever on American soil, and above all, the one where a single match would make history twice. It's June 28, 1994, at Stanford Stadium in Palo Alto, in front of nearly 75,000 spectators. Russia, competing for the first time under its own flag after the fall of the USSR, faces Cameroon, the heroic quarter-finalists of the 1990 World Cup. But that day, everything would change. One man would enter the legend. Oleg Salenko. 15th minute, first goal, 41st, second, 44th, penalty. The hat-trick was already complete by halftime. But Salenko wasn't done. He added 2 more in the 72nd and 75th minutes. 5 goals in a single match, a record never matched in World Cup history. His teammate Radchenko scored the 6th, while the legendary Roger Milla, at 42 years old, saved Cameroon's honor. This goal made him the oldest goal scorer in the history of the tournament, another record still standing today. Final score, 6-1 for Russia, a humiliation for Cameroon, but a match that became mythical, where 2 historic records were broken in a single game. 4 years later, we head to France, a legendary World Cup marked by the triumph of Les Bleus, but also by Spain's completely improbable elimination. On June 24, 1998, at the Bollaert Stadium in Lens, Spain plays its third group stage match against Bulgaria. La Roja had started the tournament poorly, a defeat against Nigeria, then a draw against Paraguay. In other words, they absolutely had to win and hope Paraguay slipped up against Nigeria to qualify. And on the pitch, the Spaniards gave everything. Hierro opened the scoring in the 6th minute from the penalty spot. Luis Enrique doubled the lead in the 18th. In the second half, Morientes scored a brace, Bachev scored an own goal, and Kiko closed out the festival in added time. Final score, 6-1 for Spain. But here's the thing. At the same time, Paraguay beat Nigeria. Result? Despite this crushing victory, Spain was eliminated in the group stage. A completely crazy scenario. That very night, La Roja left the competition with one of the biggest wins in its history, but also one of its greatest disappointments. Now we move on to 2002, and to one of the most overwhelming victories in World Cup history. The tournament took place in Asia for the first time, co-hosted by Japan and South Korea. And in the very first match of Group E, Germany would make a statement in its own way. It's June 1st, 2002, at the Sapporo Dome in Japan. Facing them, Saudi Arabia, a brave team, but completely outmatched that day. In the 20th minute, Miroslav Klose opens the scoring. 5 minutes later, he doubles the lead. In the 40th minute, Ballack drives the point home. And just before halftime, Janker adds a fourth. At the break, Germany leads 4-0. This is only the beginning of Saudi Arabia's nightmare. In the second half, Klose completes his hat trick with a header, already a sign of what his scoring style would become for the national team. Then, Linke, Bierhoff, and Schneider finish the carnage. 8-0 the final score, the biggest win of that World Cup, and one of the greatest humiliations in the history of the tournament. It was also the match that truly revealed Miroslav Klose, future all-time top scorer of the World Cup with 16 goals. A record that, potentially, Kylian Mbappe or Harry Kane could chase in 2026. Now, we move on to 2006 in Germany, a World Cup full of intensity, marked by the return of the great nations to the top, and by a true football masterclass from Argentina. On June 16, 2006, at the Veltins Arena in Gelsenkirchen, La Albiceleste faced Serbia and Montenegro for their second group stage match, a country that, by the way, no longer exists today. This was the last competition played under that name before the separation of the two nations in 2006. On the pitch, Argentina delivered a collective masterpiece. In the 6th minute, Maxi Rodriguez opened the scoring. Then, 15 minutes later, a stunning goal from Esteban Cambiaso at the end of a 24-pass move, probably one of the greatest team goals in World Cup history. Maxi Rodriguez completed his brace in the 41st minute, and at halftime, it was already 3-0. In the second half, the Argentinians kept rolling. Hernan Crespo, Carlos Tevez, and a certain Lionel Messi, who scored his first ever World Cup goal in the 88th minute. Final score, 6-0 for Argentina. We now arrive in 2010, a historic World Cup, the first ever held on African soil in South Africa. A mythical edition marked by the vuvuzelas, the Jabulani ball, and a defeat so brutal it allegedly led a national coach to be sent to forced labor. Everything happened on June 21st, 2010, at the Cape Town Stadium. Portugal faced North Korea in their second group match, a special encounter. The North Koreans were making their return to the World Cup 44 years after their legendary 1966 run, where they reached the quarterfinals, already against Portugal. Everyone was curious to see this team from such a closed-off country, and who, in their first match, had saved pride by scoring against Brazil in a 2-1 loss. But this time, the dream turned into a nightmare. After a decent first half, Portugal completely exploded in the second. Meireles, Simão, Hugo Almeida, Thiago, who scored a brace, Leedson, and the inevitable Cristiano Ronaldo delivered a 7-0 victory, the biggest of the tournament. A humiliation broadcast worldwide, and a defeat whose consequences would go far beyond football. A few weeks later, according to some Asian sources, the North Korean players were summoned to the People's Palace of Culture, where they were publicly humiliated for 6 hours in front of 400 officials, journalists, and political leaders. The coach, Kim Jong-un, was reportedly sentenced to forced labor, accused of betraying the trust of Kim Jong-il. He was allegedly sent to a mine, forced to work 12 to 14 hours a day. A historic defeat on the pitch, and a tragic one off it. Now we arrive in 2014, and this time, We're talking about a national disaster, probably the most memorable defeat of recent editions, and one of the greatest traumas for hundreds of millions of Brazilians. Brazil, the host country, awaited like never before for its World Cup. A team not always dazzling, but one that always found a way to pull through, often thanks to Neymar, the star, the hope, the symbol of an entire nation. But in the quarterfinal against Colombia, Neymar suffered a serious injury, a fractured vertebra, tournament over for the prodigy. And despite his absence, no one could imagine what was coming. On July 8, 2014, in Belo Horizonte, Brazil faced Germany in the semi-final. The entire country held its breath, but in 29 minutes, the dream turned into absolute nightmare. Germany scored 5 goals in less than half an hour. Müller, Klose, Kroos twice, and Khedira. The score was already 5-0 at halftime in an unreal silence. In the second half, Schürrle added 2 more before Oscar saved a bit of pride at the end, 1-7. Tears in the stands, devastated fans, and a broken nation. That day, Brazil suffered the heaviest defeat in its history, and arguably the greatest humiliation ever experienced at a World Cup. Now onto the second-to-last edition, with the World Cup hosted in Russia and a match that will remain in history, England versus Panama. It was a symbolic moment, as Panama was playing the very first World Cup of its history, an achievement in itself, for a country of 4 million people dreaming of standing up to the giants of world football. But very quickly, the reality of top-level competition caught up with them. On June 24, 2018, the English, led by Harry Kane, Jesse Lingard, and John Stones, delivered a true masterclass. By halftime, it was already 5-0. A hat trick from Kane, a stunning goal from Lingard, and an England side rolling over a completely overwhelmed Panama. Final score, 6-1. A heavy defeat, but still a historic moment for Panama, as Felipe Beloy scored the first World Cup goal in his country's history. A night both cruel and unforgettable, where a newcomer discovered the greatness and the harshness of the World Cup. And we finish with 2022, a World Cup as spectacular as it was controversial. The first in history to be played in winter, in Qatar, because of the unbearable summer heat. A World Cup marked by controversy, including the deaths of workers on construction sites, but also by spectacular matches and incredible storylines, all the way to a legendary final between France and Argentina. But before getting there was a humiliation that many have already forgotten, Costa Rica's, against a red-hot Spain. On November 23, 2022, at Al Thumama Stadium, the Spaniards faced an experienced Costa Rican team led by Keylor Navas, who was playing his 6th World Cup, a country we remember reaching the quarterfinals in 2014, proving this was no team of novices. But from the very first whistle, La Roja completely suffocated them. Dani Olmo opened the scoring, followed by Marco Asensio and a brace from Ferran Torres. Then came Gavi, Carlos Soler, and Alvaro Morata, 6 different scorers in total, and a historic 7-0, a complete football lesson with 82% possession and not a single shot from a Costa Rica reduced to total silence. That night, Spain reminded everyone that when they play at their highest level, they can once again become the team that terrified world football, just as they did 2 years later at the Euros. And do you think this record could be broken in 2026? If so, in which match and by which team? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Ciao.